Hi, welcome to episode 32 of the American Tributaries podcast, where to break out of the bubbles we've all been living in these last few years, we are using modern technology to explore the various currents of people in our great country, kind of like a 21st century Lewis and Clark journey. I'm your host, Michael Whidden, and thank you for joining me in this exploration of America. If you haven't already done so, please follow or subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you're using. And of course, give us a positive rating or a thumbs up on this particular episode. But most importantly, if you enjoy the podcast, please let your friends and family know on social media. Let's use that medium for some good. Before we start today's conversation, I'm proud to say that episode 32 is sponsored by American Tributaries Travel, which is the company I formed in June of this year to take the spirit of this podcast and get it on the ground and get high schoolers in our country to travel more within our country. Our first trip will be from New York to South Carolina via Amtrak, visiting Charleston, Columbia, and Greenville, departing February 18th and returning February 26th. For more details, please check out AmericanTributaries.com. Okay, this is about the fifth time we've tried this because of prior technical difficulties. Today, I am very happy and relieved to to have David Sorich on the show. David lives up near Acadia National Park in northern Maine, where he is a professor at the Maine Maritime Academy. David, thanks so much for joining me today. How are you doing? And could you share a bit of your story?
I'm doing well, and hopefully this will work. The universe has not been kind to us so far, but we'll keep trying. We'll just keep going.
Yeah.
So a little bit about me. I grew up in Utah. Parents were school teachers, elementary ed, and a high school teacher. Grandparents, hard workers. One worked for the government, one worked in the local mine. Both grandfathers served in World War II. So it's kind of a little background where I come from. I'm a pure mutt. Lots of immigrants that came over in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Mormon pioneers, Utah, it's all about the Mormons. But I wanted to get out of Utah. It was time to move on and go somewhere else. And so I applied to Penn, where I met you. But I also kind of wanted to serve my country, but I also needed a scholarship to go to Penn. So I applied for the ROTC scholarship. Yeah, applied for the ROTC scholarship. Lucky enough to get the 4-year scholarship and went to Penn. I mean, it was kind of funny. I applied for the ROTC scholarship for the Navy and the Air Force. I applied to Penn and I applied to Princeton, and I got into Penn and I got the Navy scholarship. I did not get into Princeton and I did not get the Air Force scholarship. And the funny thing was the Air Force scholarship was good at Princeton. The Navy scholarship was good at Penn. So sometimes the universe says, here you go. So that's where I went. And I enjoyed it. I had a great time at Penn. Our ROTC unit, we had a great bunch of guys. I know you still keep in touch with a few. I still keep in touch with a few. A couple are still in and working their way out. We're that old that they're finally retiring.
Yeah.
Majored in engineering, and then the Navy, in their infinite wisdom, made me a supply officer. That's the things they do. And
wait, so you didn't do what was your choices when we had that chance to say what we wanted to do?
So my first 3 choices was Civil Engineering Corps was number 1, supply officer was 2, and then you had to pick a real warfare thing for 3. So I just picked SWO because it's like if I got down my 3rd choice, I'll do surface warfare, do my 4 years, and punt and move on. So the Navy made me a supply officer. It was kind of cool. I mean, I went to Athens, Georgia, which is a random place to have a Navy base. It's right. What used to be right by the UGA campus. Now they've moved it up to Newport with a bunch of other schools that the Navy's got up there, where at least it's on the water. Got orders to go be a submarine supply officer, and submarine supply officers actually had the highest rate of attrition. They get fired at the highest rate. It's a tough job because you're the only supply officer on a submarine. Where any other ship you go to, there's at least one other. You go to a large aircraft carrier, there's 14 or 15 supply officers. So there's a lot of support there. Where on the submarine, there's no support because you're on with 14 or 15 other officers, and they're all nuclear trained and all great guys, but they look at the world in a different viewpoint. It's just they're trained to look at things from a perspective, and they need to be, right? I mean, they're running a nuclear reactor, and the last thing we want is something to go wrong with that nuclear reactor. Ended up out of Charleston, and we were there right before they were right as they were closing the base. We were one of the last few submarines to move out, and they moved us to Pearl Harbor. And we were scheduled for a 3-month. We're going to go to training, upkeep. We call it pre-overseas movement. You go do training and stuff, and then we were
Wait,
going
can
to
I
do
ask you a question? Sorry. Just how do you? I mean, I figure I know the answer, but I don't want to assume anything. How do you move the submarine from the East Coast to the West Coast? Do you go through? Can you reveal that? Do you go through the
Oh yeah,
canal? Do you have to go all the way around, or?
no. We went through the Panama Canal.
Okay.
They just so they're just moving a ship. So the thing is they sent some people ahead to Hawaii early to get things set up, move their families, and then they came back, and then we just moved the sub. We transited. We left Charleston. We went out. Went down through the Caribbean. We went through the Panama Canal. It's no secret. I mean, it's one of those things like as soon as you surface a submarine, everybody knows where it is. But we got escorted through the Panama Canal with a couple of gunships and a helicopter, making sure no one did anything to us.
Yeah, you're very vulnerable.
We're very vulnerable, but I mean, this is how vulnerable we felt. We barbecued hamburgers on the deck while we were going through the Panama Canal. So I mean, we weren't overly concerned with too much really happening to us. It was a neat experience to go through the Panama Canal because there's only certain parts that are the locks, the elevators that raise the ship up and down. Other parts are just going through like the jungles of Panama, cruising through the lake. And it was kind of fun. It was nice. And it was very warm. I'll tell you that. And I mean, I want to say it was like March. It was February, March. So it was, we're coming from Charleston, which is cool. Surfacing there. Now we're dying of the heat. Then we finished up. Then so after we went through the Panama Canal, as we were heading towards Hawaii, we dipped down below the equator to make sure that we could do the crossing the line ceremony. Where people get initiated from wogs to shellbacks. We had a good time. It was, it was the kinder, gentler Navy, so the antics weren't quite as crazy, but people still got gross, and we still did a swim call in the middle of the Pacific out there all by ourselves. And the funny part is you don't think half a knot is very fast. But it is, because our captain was like, we're waiting to come to dead stop, right? To be DIW, dead in the water, just floating in the water. And the captain was in such a hurry to get in the water. He heard that, it was only half a knot headway, and he jumped in. And next thing we know, the captain's about 300 yards behind the sub and
Wow.
floating further and further away.
Wow.
So they had to kick the. I mean, luckily, I think he had swim fins on, so it's the ocean, so you can float pretty good. But luckily, it was warm water. But we had to kick the engine back up and turn the sub around and go get the captain. It was funny. It was funny. But we had a good time. I got to jump off because we had you got the Fairwater planes, which are up on the sail that stick out. So that was a 15, 20 foot diving board. So we'd climb up the sail and jump off of those and swim around. And, they had some guy up with a gun to make sure that he was the shark watch, but we didn't have any issues with that. And after we had our little fun, a bunch of naked sailors swimming in the ocean, we loaded back up and headed towards Hawaii. And there we got there, and we were doing a training exercise. So, we actually ran aground. And when I say ran aground, we did it 400 feet below the surface of the ocean. We were doing a tracking exercise, and we needed to turn left to keep tracking the sub. Otherwise, we would have lost it behind us, because you can't hear it, because the propeller behind the submarine makes noise, and anything behind there, you can't hear anything going on, for those that, not Navy experts. But turning left was to keep the sub tracking. We can hear where it is. But turn right was to safe water. And the navigation team and the OD was like, well, let's turn right. And the captain screamed, no, gall darn it, you'll turn left. They said, all right. And we turned left, and we ran into the island of Kauai. 400 feet below the surface of the ocean. Luckily, we were going really slow. We hit and we kind of bounced and scraped along because we started about 400 feet, and I was up in the control room right before that, and they just relieved me. The thing I was doing was not really doing any good for what they were doing from a tracking perspective. I had some tool, and just what I did didn't matter. So I went down, and as good supply officers do, I went to my office and started playing solitaire on the computer. and, and so
And that was all we had back then too. I remember the solitaire on the computers. That was it.
That was it. That was about all you had. So I was playing solitaire on my computer, and a lot of the crew that wasn't involved in the tracking was sent to their bunk. So there weren't really people up walking around because you don't want people making noise. And even though we're just tracking a U.S. sub for practice, we gotta think it's real, And all of a sudden, the ship just lurched. It kind of shuddered, and I'm like, what the heck was that? So I ran up to control, and I could see that our headway was now 0, where before we were doing 2 to 3 knots. And then our depth was up to like 350. And I'm like, that's not good. The captain, gets on the 1MC mic and says, engineering, report the cause of the shudder, and my buddy was the engineering officer to watch. And he's like, I know what the problem was, but I wasn't about to answer back. He's like, the problem is we ran aground, but he's like, I'm looking into it, sir, and so he looks in, they get back and they figure out that we're stuck in the mud. And so we have to do a 3-second blow of our ballast tanks. We have to put high pressure air, force water out of the water. We have ballast tanks, which we take water in. That makes us negative buoyant. That helps us sink, right? So if we want to go up, we got to put air into those tanks and force the water out to give us positive buoyancy to float up. So we did that, and we floated up, and there's emergency procedures because we're tracking another sub. So there's another sub in the area. So the standard practice is then you have to go. You have to get on a speaker that actually projects out into the ocean, so the other sub can hear you, and you go deep, 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 coming shallow, 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 and that means we're going to the surface. Something happened. We're going to the surface, and then their response also is to put it on the surface, because going on the surface we have a better chance of seeing each other, not running into each other, whereas under the water we have a better chance of like something bad happening, and luckily nothing happened. So the exercise, of course, got called off, and we went in. And so the funny thing is we had just gotten there. We had just gotten to Hawaii. We'd been there a week, maybe 2 weeks tops, and Friday was going to be our big welcoming. They had the whole plan set up at the officers club at the submarine base, welcome the USS Bluefish and all the officers to Hawaii. We limp in on Thursday. They put, as soon as we get in, they're putting divers in the water to see the damage of the bottom of the sub. Luckily, we damaged there was a dent in the ballast tank, which no big deal. The people tank was fine, but we did scrape off a bunch, like our pith sword, which measured our speed. So that was like left somewhere in the bottom of the ocean. There's also some sonar. We have there are many different types of sonar listening devices on a sub, different frequencies and ranges and types. And we scraped 2 or 3 of those off the bottom. And then
good thing you guys had a good supply officer that could order all this stuff, right?
Well, some of that stuff, that's shipyard supply officer. That's not me. They won't let me order that stuff. But we were scheduled to decom was the thing too. So this was March, April-ish. We were scheduled to go on a 3-month deployment, September, October, November, and then we lost our hull certification December 1st. And all that meant was we needed to go to the shipyard to get recertified to make sure that, the steel of the sub was not going to have a catastrophic failure. So they realized that a lot of that stuff on the bottom we didn't necessarily need for the 3-month deployment. We sandblasted all the paint. Whatever paint was there was gone. And so they just decided, like, okay, well, the sub's in good shape. Nothing else got damaged. We don't need to really do much. You're going to the shipyard. We're going to decom you anyways. So keep proceeding. However, the captain got relieved, um, as they tend to when they run aground. Sadly, he took the OOD and the navigation officer down with him, even though they wanted to turn towards safe water. They didn't object enough, I guess, was what the board found. It was, I don't know. I thought they got kind of a raw deal. Got a new captain on board. That captain ended up becoming one of my mentors. That's where I really, I kind of mentioned, but it's those leadership experiences, and it's experience like that changes how you look at life. Not necessarily overly philosophically. It wasn't like we never felt like we were scared or we were going to die or anything like that. But you do look at leadership really hard. Like, what kind of leader do I want to be? Do I want to be like that guy that just, ran us aground and put us potentially in danger? I mean, other subs have hit other things. One sub hit a seamount a few years ago, an uncharted seamount, and they were going so fast that sadly a sailor died. The sub hits and it stopped. It's just like in a car. It was doing 20, 30 knots, hit that seamount. Guy went flying and, went head first into, on board ship. There's not any padding. There's nothing but pipes and walls and metal and steel. And his head hit that directly, and that was it. And there were a lot of other people with broken bones. So, I mean, all things considered, we got off pretty lucky. But we were able to finish our 3-month deployment. We got a new captain on board. That new captain is one of my greatest mentors. I still have him write letters of recommendation for me. I still keep in touch with him. We did the obligatory port calls in Hong Kong and Japan, which was always funny to pull into. We pulled into Sasebo, Japan, which is by Nagasaki, and so there's still feelings because of the Nagasaki bomb. And as we pulled in, I say funny, but there were protesters on the side of the river as we pull in or whatever else, and they're yelling at us in Japanese, and they got these signs up in Japanese, and we're sure they're protesting us, but for all we know, it's like, welcome to Japan, have a good time,
Irashamase. Oh, you would have heard that. I thought you heard that though.
Yeah, they were far. It was one of those, like, they were definitely far away. They're trying to yell at it with bullhorns, but who knows? But I will say, I mean, we pulled into Nagasaki, Sasebo, and we did take an MWR tour over to Nagasaki in the Peace Park, which is a very sobering experience. It's the bomb was horrific. I mean, let's be honest. But it's nice to see the Peace Park has a lot of different statues and artwork that's donated by a lot of countries throughout the world. And the idea is, like, let's not do the same thing again, right? Let's keep the peace and not do this, because as humans we tend to sadly we don't seem to learn from history very well. We seem to like a lot of wars and battles every few years. I don't know why, but there's always somebody, I guess. So
yeah. When I was because I was stationed in Japan for 3 years, and we went down, I forget what the name of the base was near Hiroshima, but I remember going, I think at night. I think it was like my only chance to go, and it wasn't, I don't even know if it was open where I could get in, but I could see like the atom dome that they have there, and in like the quiet, and then like my moment of, like, I guess, thinking about it. What I found interesting was that in the silence, the only noise that I could hear was the sound of a baseball game around the corner
interesting.
I actually wrote one of my like law school essays about how, like, to me there was that sign of, like, kind of like rebirth, and that sign of like reconciliation. And I think that I've found that living in Japan for 3 years and being in those situations, like being in Hiroshima, is a very I think, growing up in the United States, for like people like you or me, being a white man, you just get used to kind of seeing things from that perspective, and you don't even know what it feels like to not be somebody who looks like most of the other people. So going into Japan, just not looking like anybody else and not understanding the culture and being kind of separate from it is a very humbling experience. And then to be in this situation where, yeah, it was a war and there was bad things happening on both sides, but to be at a spot where, like, yes, my country did this to these people, is a very it's a very uncomfortable very sad, very humbling position to be in, and I think it kind of makes you see things from like other sides. And I think it's like a caricature when people talk about people in the military, but I don't think anybody in the military, like, that's your job, is to go to war. But I think that, in at least from the people that I talk to, it's not like anybody in the military actually wants to go to war. Like that, because everybody knows what's really at stake.
Yeah.
And I like when the Ukraine stuff started happening, and I don't want to talk about like current events per se, but one of the things that I heard my kids who were on TikTok, and they're seeing people on TikTok talking about Ukraine and World War III and stuff, and I said to them, like, guys, we have to take more responsibility for what we're putting out there and what we're consuming, because unless you have skin in the game, you can't be the one talking us into a World War III. Like, you've got to, we can't do that. We have to learn our lessons from the past and try to be more sober and more respectful. There are people with real lives at stake and families with real loved ones at stake who could be the ones that go into that war if God forbid that's the worst that happens. So, but I think you can only really know that if you've been in the military before. Otherwise, for a lot of people, it's just throwing words out there and talking about it, because it doesn't happen to you. You're not the one who goes out there. And
Yeah.
even like you're talking about, just everyday things too. It's not just about the combat. It's about just having a submarine underwater is dangerous things that are happening.
Oh yeah, and it's. I didn't know too many people really ever wanted to go to war.
No,
When I was in the Navy, it's one of those things like we're ready to go if we got to do it, but yeah, this is let's not. If we don't have to, let's not do it.
yeah,
And at Nagasaki, it was interesting too because I have been to Pearl Harbor, right? Change points to
yeah,
Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. So I was
yeah.
right there. I've been to Pearl Harbor. I've been to the Nagasaki Peace Park, and I've been to Auschwitz and Birkenau. And it is such an interesting thing. I mean, it is so sobering because every site is so peaceful. Was the irony, or the polar opposite, the polarity of life, the yin and the yang, right? Because here are three places for where horrific things happened, like massively horrific things happened, right? And yet the days I'm there, like all 3 days, the days I was there, it was like they were sunny days, beautiful sky. I'm at Auschwitz and we're sitting there. We're right outside the museum where they've got rooms full of stuff they've collected off of the people they've taken to the work camp. So there's a room full of shoes. It's like 10 feet deep, 50 feet wide by 100 feet long. There's another one of like luggage and different things like that. And you're just, and the birds are singing, and it's a beautiful day, and you're just kind of like, how? Like how? It's almost like you think that the ground should not sprout forth anything, right? Such massive atrocities happen in this location that it should just be like dead forever, but it's not, and that's one of the, like, we've had conversations, we've talked about hope, and that was kind of one of those things where it's like, it's kind of, it's a little hope, like life does go on, even though horrific things happen and bad people do bad things, but there are still good people and there's still good things in the world going on. And it just struck me. And when I was in Auschwitz, I mean, everybody was humble and very sober, but you could tell the difference. The people that had served in a military, it was a very different experience for those, because part of my class, we had people from so I got my master's degree at the London Business School because I was stationed in the UK as my last tour as a supply officer. And so, I had people in my class from all over the world, a bunch from Europe. And so there were people from the British military. There were people that had served their countries, whether it was like a South Africa or a Japan or a Sweden, some countries that have mandatory like 1 or 2 year requirements. And you could tell that those people took it a little bit differently, just for whatever reason. And the same thing with Nagasaki. And I mean, and it
What do you
was,
mean when you say they took it differently?
I don't know. It's just the feeling, you could tell by the look, like, everybody understood the atrocity. Everybody understood the sadness. Everybody understood what terrible things happened. But it just seemed like there was like maybe a more deeper meaning, because the thing about the military and the service is you're willing to put your life on the line for something other than yourself, and it may sound corny, but in reality, it's true. Like you're willing to take a bullet for your buddy, the person next to you. You're willing to do what it takes to protect people that just can't, protect themselves, right? Um, and because of that, I know I look at life differently. Like I have a lot of friends. They support the military. They support veterans. They're very grateful for the U.S. military. But we'll talk about it. And they just they'll ask me about it, and I'll tell them, and they just don't quite get it because they haven't put. I think it's just because they haven't really put themselves out there. Where on the sub, every time we submerged the sub, we were taking our lives in our own hands. It's kind of like flying an airplane. It's you want the ups to equal the downs. And you type thing, and you want to make sure that an airplane, you don't want a down to be a crash. But so maybe just a little bit deeper meaning, a little bit deeper thought. Maybe more sad because the thing is the people I've always served with were always good people, and I would like to think that they wouldn't do what a lot of the German military did. Like they just following orders. But the hard thing is you never know until you're in those situations. But I did feel that those of us that served in a military, there was a little bit deeper meaning, a little bit deeper understanding, or a little more sadness.
Well, the other part of it, really maybe is it's almost like whether it's right or wrong almost becomes, unfortunately it becomes, when you're in warfare, it becomes almost it's a relative thing, right? Because,
Right.
there was a pilot that had to fly the plane and press the button to drop the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So I think, to me, it almost seems like there's a soberness to realizing like what you would have to do in that situation and how hard it would be to do it. And if you have to go out with a gun and shoot people, you're killing people. And I think that look, let's be honest. There are people in New York City, it's we're living in, I live, it's one of it's lots of comforts, and sure there's lots of stress, but there's just, there's a lot of money, there's a lot of comfort, there's a lot of luxury, and there are a lot of people who need to talk to a therapist, and they need medication, right? And they're not going through the stuff that you go through in the military or as a policeman or a firefighter. There's so much, they're not seeing that actual life and death trauma
Yep.
that you experience in the military. So if it's hard for just an everyday person, and God knows it is, right, just to get by, imagine adding that sense of either responsibility for other people's lives and the responsibility for maybe having to take out other people's lives, perhaps in mass level. It's a hard thing. And I think that's the thing that, like you said, there's a difference when you've had that service and you had to wear those shoes and know that the time could come. For me, I was never in combat. I served actively from 94 to 97. I was never in a wartime situation, but that's still, that it always exists. Something can happen where you've got to throw yourself out there. And for a lot of people, that actually does happen.
Yeah.
So,
Well, and then eventually I ended up on an aircraft carrier, and we were in the Gulf, 98. And I think that was around when the Somalian embassy was bombed. So it was our carrier strike group that let out a retaliatory strike. So it's like, even though I'm the bowels of the ship, planes were flying off, missiles were being fired from our Air Force carrier group, and they were causing damage, and I know killed a few people. So it's I wasn't necessarily in combat, but I was. In the Navy is about as close as I was going to get, but
yeah.
it happened. It does happen. So
Yeah.
it's not easy, but yeah. So, anyways, it's very, very interesting to be at different places, beginnings and ends and middles of World War II. But that wrapped up. We finished up that deployment and went back to Hawaii. and there we just decommed. It was rough, let me tell you. I spent a lot of time improving my golf game. Yeah, adding up my dive time on my scuba counter. Uh, once we moved the sub into the shipyard, there was nothing for me to do. We closed the galley down. We offloaded the repair parts, but I needed more time because it was going to get me to 22 months. So my first tour, like I think yours is like was supposed to be, it's supposed to be 36 months, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, and so they were the closest I got to 24. They were going to give me my checkbox for my Divo tour and let me move on to something else. But it was like I had to get as close as I could. So they're like, well, we're not going to transfer you off early, so hang out for a while. I'm like, okay. I had a really good time. Left there and went to Pennsylvania, Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, which is where a large supply center is. Actually, it's where the Navy supply officer, the 08, the 2-star admiral, had his location. Went there for as an internship. They wanted to teach me, we call it cradle to grave logistics support. So how do you set up logistics for repair parts and that kind of stuff for new weapon systems like planes and tanks and ships, and then go to the grave where you decommission it, right? There I met my wife. I went to church one Sunday, and that was all she wrote. I met my wife, and we dated for 2.5, 3 years before we finally got married. Part of it was she was taking a year off of college, and then she went back to college, and then I got transferred to Everett, Washington, and I got there a lot sooner because the guy I was supposed to replace had a heart attack.
Ooh.
38 years old, heart attack. I met him. He luckily survived. I met him later. They transferred him to shore duty. He was a very anxious person, so it's like I can see kind of why you might have heart issues. But they kicked me out of Mechanicsburg at like the 18-month point. So I'd finished like 2 tours in the time it takes most people to do one, and they sent me up to the USS Abraham Lincoln out of Everett, Washington. And I got to take over the worst department the worst division on the ship. I had more people in restriction than any other division on the ship. So that I don't know if you did on your ship. They'd go around with the little pink badges with the R on them, so everybody knew they couldn't leave the ship because they'd screwed up and done something wrong somewhere. And they were all young. So I'm 25 years old now, and I'm managing a division of 50, 60 people, and half of them are between 18 and 19 years old. And we're trying to get ready for deployment, and everybody's doing everything they can to get out of deployment because they're just young. They don't want to go away for 6 months. They've never been anywhere else, right? Boyfriends and girlfriends were trying to get pregnant, so that'd be an excuse for them to not go. Boys would get hurt and try to hurt themselves, and my knees wrecked. I can't go on deployment. And so my chiefs and I got together, and we said, all right, we need to have a little chat with everybody. And I had a big enough division. I had a senior chief, and then I had 3 chiefs. And we got everybody together. We said, look, deployment is why you joined the Navy. This is why you joined. You joined the Navy to leave whatever podunk town in the middle of America you come from. Like I had one girl, she only had to address her family by like Daddy Dave, small town Indiana, and didn't have to put a zip code on the bloody letter because her cousin was the postmaster. Like that's how small the town was.
Wow.
And so we told them all, like, this is why you want to go because we ended up pulling into Hong Kong. We pulled into Singapore. We spent time in the Gulf. We pulled into Jebel Ali a few times. On the way back, we hit Perth, Australia. And then we hit Hobart, Australia. I got to do some scuba diving off of Perth. I tell you, the Gulf was hot. I have never been anything like that. We pulled into Jebel Ali, and it was 130 degrees during the day. And then at night, the temperature dropped to 100. but then the humidity would kick up to 100%. So it was just miserable. They put this little beer garden out in front of the aircraft carrier because they didn't want all the 18-year-olds going into town and getting drunk. So they actually would let the 18-year-olds have beer. We kept a ton of beer on board the carrier, and it was the wise thing to do. But I went out to hang out a couple of nights where I was like, I worked late, and I was like, I'm not going into town, and I went out to sit down with everybody else, and I'm like, forget this. I'm going back where the air conditioning's still on. It's just too
Wow.
hot. Just too hot. The one of the air wing guys, they always make deployment patches, and one of the squadrons made a patch, and it said something like, hell was 10 degrees cooler type thing.
Well, you're in a very different setting now, living in Maine, right? It
Living in
means,
Maine. Well, and so I eventually, I ended up I ended up in London, England.
yeah.
I was a supply officer there. Worked on my master's degree at London Business School, and then hit the 9-year point. And I was like, if I cross 10, I'm staying in. And I was like, you know what? I think I'm done. My wife and I, we found out we had some fertility issues. And if I stayed in the Navy, I was going to have to go get on some large haze gray ship and spend a lot of time out to sea, which, trying to have kids is not conducive to making that happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I decided to get out. And then we ended up in New Jersey for a year and then Connecticut for 15 years. And so we like New England and we like the cold, actually, my wife and I. We do like the cold. We like it cool. When we first got married, we sat down and we looked at the map of the U.S. and said, where would we like to live? And it was Pacific Northwest or New England. That was kind of it. We didn't want to go anywhere else. We wanted 4 seasons, and we didn't want to die of the heat. Connecticut used to get hot for a couple of weeks in July, where it did 95 degrees, 100% humidity. It was kind of miserable. But otherwise, it was cool. And then, so I worked for Staples for a bunch of years, and I did a bunch of different jobs. I managed a delivery operation. Again, I got the worst thing in the whole network, and somehow I was able to turn that one around. A lot of work, a lot of dealing with people, a lot of poor motive. Like nobody was happy. It was one of those fun places where just they're working but they don't have enough initiative to quit and go find something else. So I did have to help a few of them out the door just because their performance was that bad and they just didn't want to be there. They were miserable. It's like, you guys you need to move on and go find something else because life is so short. It's not worth being this miserable.
Yeah.
Did a bunch of project management stuff, worked for Staples for 15 years. And then a friend of mine, I don't know if you knew him or not, is David Souter. He was at Penn with us.
Sounds familiar.
He's a Wharton guy. He ended up at the University of Connecticut. He's a professor at University of Connecticut in strategy. And I was kind of exploring other things to do. And I asked him what it was like being a college professor. And we talked about it, and I was kind of interested. And then they needed some adjuncts. And they needed some either on their operations side, teaching supply chain, or teaching strategy. And I said, I'd be more interested in teaching strategy. So I was like, well, apply. We're looking for some. So I applied and they let me teach. And I really enjoyed it. And I had a great time with it. So I started looking other ways. And I was doing that kind of on the side with Staples. Because the other part was, this was right around 2013. So we're coming out of the recession. And Staples had the philosophy, their pay salary philosophy was, we'll pay you a good salary, but then we'll give you a really good bonus when you earn it. Well, but the problem is through those recessionary years, the company didn't do well. So as a company, we just didn't get any bonuses. Like there were a couple of years we didn't get any bonus at all. Where before they were giving us 10 to 15% of our salary. So going from 10 to 15% bonus to zero, that hurt the pocketbook.
Sure.
So I need a little extra cash. And so that kind of motivated me there too. And so I started looking, and I ended up doing adjunct stuff at the Manchester Community College. And then the Coast Guard Academy was looking for someone. And so I applied with them and got the job. It was a 2-year job. Actually, technically, it was a 1-year job with a 1-year option. And I took it. I got the option. They reposted it, and I got the job again and did 2 more years. And then they were changing directions of where they were going. And so they didn't renew my contract. And so then it was the old, well, I need a job. where to now, honey? So I applied all over Connecticut, Massachusetts, and I applied to Maine Maritime. And, we were looking at the map, and it's like, wow, that's pretty far up there. We didn't realize how far up it really is, because we're up by Acadia, up by Ellsworth. We're on the coast. We're it's called down east Maine. They divide Maine into south, central, and east. And it's pretty much
how far are you like along the coast? How far till you get to the Canadian border? Like, I guess.
So if you go straight up the coast, it's a couple of hours, the Canadian border, like just on a straight line, because we are right on the coast. I mean, looking out my window, the ocean's right there. But south is Portland, central is Augusta, east is Bangor, and what they call county. County's that northern part of Maine that there's really nothing there, right? You're up there hanging out with the moose and the Canadians up there, and it gets cold and snowy up there. But so the thing is to put it in perspective, we're about 2:45, 3 hours north of Portland.
Okay.
So it's pretty good. And then Acadia from our house is about another hour up the coast, northeast up the coast to get to Acadia. So I applied, and the only job offer I got was Maine Maritime. And we'd been in Connecticut for 15 years. We'd overcome our fertility issues. We have 4 kids now.
Congratulations.
Thank you. They're a lot of work. They're a handful. They're great. I've got a daughter, Matilda, who's 15, getting ready to turn 16 as a sophomore in high school. I have a son, Charles, 8th grade, a son, Albert, in 5th grade, and a son, Henry, in 3rd grade. The first 3. Yeah, thank you. We need all the help we can.
I got 3 as well, but you gotta even stretching across more age range.
When you get past 2, you got to go zone, and that's where it gets tough. You're no longer man to man anymore. But they're good kids, but they're trying to figure themselves out, like your kids. I'm sure they're great kids, but every now and then they'll do something where they're pushing boundaries. They're trying to figure out who they are. What buttons can I push on mom? And my kids do that just as much as anybody else's kids do. But they're great. They're a lot of fun. We have a lot of fun with them, when they're not pushing our buttons. But I was thinking back, I pushed my parents' buttons. I know my wife pushed her parents' buttons. So it's part of growing up,
Yeah.
It's hard part is having that patience, right? Yes, you're not a full-fledged adult yet. No, your brain is not fully developed yet. No, sorry, that's not a good idea to go do that. No, not a good thing.
Yeah.
But so we were in Connecticut, for 15 years, and it was such a hard thing to move because we're ingrained in the community. We had a local church group we were with. We're good friends there. But it's one of those, like, sometimes the universe, for me, it's a faith that, that God wanted me somewhere else, and Maine, was it. But it was still a struggle, because even my wife was like, yeah, I don't know why we're going to Maine, but this is where we ended up. And we've enjoyed it. One benefit, we got here in 2019, the fall of 2019. And so it was kind of nice being up here through the COVID stuff of 2020. But we hadn't sold our home in Connecticut because I got sick, and it took the doctors a while to figure out what it was. And it was something called sarcoidosis. They don't know what causes it. Time gets rid of it. But for a while they thought I had lymphoma. So I actually had to go do a biopsy. They cut me open and had a slide. So they cut a hole in my neck and slid something down to the lymph nodes in my lungs to see if they were cancerous. So thank goodness it wasn't. It was just this thing that just takes time. And it's a weird disease because the fatigue, like, I just got over COVID, and the fatigue with COVID was pretty good. But the fatigue with the sarcoidosis was like magnitude like 10 to 20 worse. Like I literally all I want to do is sleep.
That's
And
not.
then
And it's not. We're not talking like parenthood. Like worse than parenthood.
yeah, it was worse. I
Yeah.
mean, because it was like yeah, and then I was in pain. Like all my
Ooh.
joints, like my knees and my ankles and my hips hurt. And then other joints started to swell, like my wrists and my elbows started to swell up. I mean, it was really weird. And first they thought it was Lyme disease, then they thought it was cancer, and then they thought it was some other virus or something or other. And they gave me all these meds and nothing worked. And then they did chest x-rays and my lymph nodes were swollen, but not as much as a lymphoma. But they're like, well, let's go. And maybe we're catching it early. So anyways, but so we ended up, being able to hunker down up here in Maine, whereas we like to say social distancing is a way of life. It's
Yeah.
not, it's not like a COVID thing. It's just, that's normal.
Yeah.
The joke with everybody up here too is, everybody's like, it was the 6 feet COVID rule. People in Maine are like, why so close?
So wait. So how? Like, what's So the what like what's how many people are in your town? Like, what's the? I mean, compared to. I mean, you can't compare it to New York, but like, give me a sense of like how many people or not many people are around you.
Well, here, I'll put it to you this way. So in Connecticut, we're in the town of Coventry, and we were just one town over from Yukon. So we had quite a few Yukon people that lived there. Not a large town, but from a school-wise, I think, perspective. So basically, we had what's called a grammar school, an elementary school, a middle school, and a high school. Grammar was K to 2, elementary was 3, 4, 5, middle school standard 6 to 8, right? High school 9 to 12. There were pretty much 4 grades or 4 classes per grade, and about 20 kids per class. So whatever that equates to. Okay. The town we are in now, there are 2 classes per grade with about 12 kids per class. So
Wow.
that tells you how small it is. I mean, yeah. And then we've got other towns on the peninsula with us. They have 1 class per grade and about 5 to 6 kids per class. So there's like 60 kids in the school from pre-K to 8. There's 60 kids.
Wow. Different world.
Different
So,
world. That's how. I mean, it's small. It's small America. I mean, Ellsworth is the biggest city closest to it. It's about a half an hour away. They're big enough. They actually have a Taco Bell and a Wendy's, and a Walmart and a Home Depot. Our town is kind of the center of the peninsula, so we do have like a little Hammond Lumber and a small grocery store. It's not like a mini. It's bigger than a mini mart, but it's smaller than like a large Hannaford out in the town somewhere else. So it's very small town. And the thing is we've kind of learned that everybody's kind of related to everybody else. Like everybody's cousins of somebody. Not a lot of people have left Maine. They're very proud. They're very proud of being from Maine, and they're hardy folk. They're good workers. Although I kind of think they take the pride a little too far. But I'm an outsider. I'm a from away. Like that's what they like to call people, where you're from away. And so the closest person in my family that can not have the from away marker would be if my daughter has a kid in Maine. Like my daughter gets married, has a kid in Maine, and then that kid gets married to somebody in Maine and has a kid. Then that kid, like my grandson or daughter or great grand, they could be considered Mainers. The rest of us, we're still from away.
all right. Well, you gotta lay out the family plan.
I got to lay out the family plan, I guess. I don't know. I mean, who knows how long we'll be here? I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, I have no plans to leave.
Yeah.
Love teaching in MMA. I mean, MMA is a small school. We got about 900 to 1,000 students. We have a marine trans department. We have engineering, power engineering. So all those relate to people going out to go become merchant marine people, either third engineer or third officers on board those ships. We have an ocean studies department. I'm part of the international business logistics department. And then we have an arts and sciences department, which really supports the others. They don't give a degree, which is why I say they support. The other departments offer degrees, but we want to balance it out. We want to make sure people have a nice balanced education. Like, we don't want engineers just to do engineering. We want them to take a few
Right.
humanities classes along the
Right.
way.
So is this a 4 year? It's a 4 year school.
Warrior school.
Okay.
The people working on licenses have to wear uniforms. They're part of the regiment. The commander of our regiment is a retired Coast Guard officer. He's an 06 captain for Coast Guard and Navy. Would be a colonel in the Army. Yeah, we have a lot of retired people that have retired from Merchant Marine that teach here. And it's a great little school. We're right on the water. We have a training ship. We're going to get a new training ship. The federal government is supplying all the Maritime's new training ships. But they're also supposed to be like emergency response ships to be able to help out with stuff like hurricanes, that kind of stuff. So they've got housing and medical facilities. So the different maritime schools, there's a Cal Maritime, there's a Texas Maritime, which is done by Texas A&M. There's a SUNY Maritime, Maine Maritime, Mass Maritime, and then different. We kind of we consider ourselves the five, and then you got the Merchant Marine Academy. It's kind of on their own.
So can you like, so what Kings Point is
Merchant Marine.
Merchant Marine. So that's the Merchant Marine Academy.
Merchant Marine.
So and I've never really been able to dive into like understand this. Like what exactly is Merchant Marine? Like, it's paid for by the government, right? It's like the military. So it's paid for by the government. It's not military though.
Well, it is, because actually to go to the Merchant Marine Academy, you need an appointment, just like you would go to the military academy, the Naval Academy, or Air Force Academy.
And what does this allow you to do once you graduate from the Merchant Marine Academy?
So someone graduated the Merchant Marine Academy. So there's different routes. A lot end up in the Merchant Marine,
right,
where they have an obligation to go work. But like, there was an officer in the Coast Guard that when I was teaching there, he went to the Merchant Marine Academy. So he went there and got a commission in the Coast Guard. I think I even knew people in the Navy that went to Merchant Marine Academy and then were commissioned as Navy officers. Mm-hmm. So there's a little bit of play of what you can do, but they end up. But it is a funded school. They do have an obligation. They've got to meet, and they have to have an appointment. Where the interesting is, the Coast Guard Academy does not. You don't have to have an appointment to go there. You can just apply.
Oh,
like a regular school.
So then you graduate from the Merchant Marine, and now you get a job on like a container ship, or
like some ship somewhere.
Just some ship now, but aren't a lot of those ships flagged like for Cyprus in Cyprus or the Philippines or other countries? Or do you have to get assigned? Do you get assigned to a ship that's an American flagship? I mean, what's happening there?
I don't know. I would think if you go to the Merchant Marine Academy, which is slightly different than our regiment, but I would think that they would probably go to like more military sea lift command type ships. Stuff that are run by us, but they probably can go out and get private jobs too. But I don't know for sure. I keep meaning to pull the chain on that one and get a little more information, but I haven't done it yet. But
okay.
But they could go do a lot of different things. We have a lot of people too that end up leaving this school and they'll go work on like oil rig platforms. So there's a lot of different jobs they can do. I mean, they're all around the maritime industry. Something on the water, something on the ocean. And as a school, we're starting to get involved too in like offshore wind, that kind of stuff. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different things, but I don't know how many are locked into like the Military Sea Lift Command, or end up on some tender somewhere, or what. I mean, there are a bunch of supply ships that. They're not technically Navy ships, but they're U.S. government ships. And I know a lot of people, Merchant Marine, I'm sure they ended up there. Same with, some of our regiment here end up out there.
Interesting. Wow. Sounds like we could do a whole another episode just on talking about the career opportunities. I think it's a career option that I think, when during the traditional like high school experience, you don't really ever think about.
No, you don't. I mean, I was surprised at the Coast Guard Academy. You could just apply like a regular school. Like, you didn't need an appointment letter. I was like really surprised at that.
Yeah. So, so I guess with with your work in supply and with your connection to merchant marine and like I guess shipping logistics and stuff. I mean, the last few years have been, I mean, a pretty torturous experience for the logistical world, right? I mean, it's
Well,
everywhere.
it is everywhere, and part of the reason it's everywhere is when things work, nobody cares to know anything about it, right? It's always when things go wrong that everybody starts digging in, and even when I was in the Navy, the joke always was, how hard is it to be a supply officer? And you just like you'd roll your eyes and you'd shake your head, and you're just like you just have no idea, like the amount of stuff and effort and time, and how many times things get touched just to get here. It was so funny. We changed home ports from Charleston to Hawaii, and it was so hard for people to comprehend that FedEx was now 2 days because they were used. We're in Charleston, so if we needed a part, most of the parts were either in Norfolk or in Groton, Connecticut. We could do a Delta Dash and be there that night. We could do a FedEx and be there the next day. You get to Hawaii and it's 2 days because it's one day just to get to LA or San Francisco. And then it's a second day to get from there onto the island and then delivered. It's so funny where people just they don't think that being that far away and that island was really going to affect that. And they were just in such shock. Like, I can't believe FedEx is not next day to Hawaii. And you're like, have you looked at a map recently? Like, just look at the map. Just look, see where Hawaii is compared to everything else, but part of it is too, I mean, I'm actually trying to write a little paper talking about what's called safety stock. And safety stock is something we don't talk about much anymore. Even in my supply chain books, you can't see them, but they're behind me in my office. Very little is even mentioned about safety stock. And safety stock is like your savings account. It's meant to be a buffer against unplanned expenses, right? And everybody's gone to just in time. So the whole philosophy of just in time is I'm going to decrease my inventory to only what I need to get me through a few days because I'm going to have a continuous chain, right? I'm like a train. Like as I use up one car on the train, the next day the next car will show up, and then I'll use up that stock and sell it or whatever, and then the next car will show up. And so you don't keep a lot on hand. And so what ends up happening, though, is you get these shocks to the system. And so one term that gets used is what's called a black swan event, right? And they're supposed to be unplanned events. It was called black swan events because they felt that black swans were very rare, but I think it ended up being before, they realized there's plenty of black swans down in Australia. But the whole idea, though, is it's supposed to be unplanned events, big shocks to the system. Another way to look at it, too, I kind of sometimes will throw out to my students is the butterfly effect. Butterfly flaps its wings in Brazil and a hurricane sprouts up in New York or Connecticut or Florida, right? And so you have little things that can cause big anomalies. And the problem is when you're just in time living paycheck to paycheck, and all of a sudden you take the car into the shop for the oil change, you got money for the oil change, right? And then the guy does the 30-point free inspection, and they come back out and they say, you need new brakes, right? And now all of a sudden you're like, I got to come up with $1,500 to $2,000, depending on, what vehicle it is, the brakes and everything else. And that causes a shock to your system because you don't have that money laying around because you're living just in time or paycheck to paycheck. So now, but a safety stock or a savings account, if something happens, like I know you don't want to talk about current events, but let's Ukraine. Why is Ukraine such a big deal to the world? Do you know?
No. I'm not going to hazard.
Ukraine, the Ukraine produces 1/3 of the world's wheat supply. Not 1/3 of Europe's, not 1/3 of Africa's, 1/3 of the world's supply. So the thing is having a war go on in Ukraine now that poses food and starvation problems for the rest of the world. Because I've read different things, and it's like at any given time in the world, there's about 90 days worth of food supply in existence. So any shock to any system that throws that off, we're in trouble. Prices will go up in economics, supply and demand. The supply goes down, the price has to adjust, the price starts to go up. And who takes the hit? Well, it's the poorer countries that are going to take the bigger hit because they can't afford to buy the higher priced wheat, right? And so it's that. But if you have a safety stock, if you have a storage of wheat and something like that happens, you can pull from the wheat, right? The old story from the Old Testament, Joseph in Egypt, right? I don't know how familiar you are with it, but anyways, they end up, Joseph prophesies there'll be 7 years of plenty of wheat and everything else, but they know that it's going to be followed by 7 years of famine. So the first thing they do is they start building granaries, and then during the years of plenty, they take all the extra and put it in the granaries to store, so that way when they don't have any, they've got wheat for food. And that's what a safety stock is. And we've gone so far away because everything is just in time. We don't have safety stock. We don't have granaries filled with food. People don't have cupboards filled with canned goods. We don't have, look at the microchips. When the earthquake happened around Fukushima 2010, 2012, the world didn't have electronic components coming out of Japan, and the big 3 automakers in Detroit were worried because they didn't have any chips to put in the cars. And we're having the same problem now. Like Ford's got vehicles sitting that they can't ship, at least like a month or two ago they did. They couldn't ship because they didn't have microchips. Because we keep 1 or 2 days worth of microchips on hand, and once that 1 or 2 days are up, they're out. So, and that's part of the problem is we don't have a buffer for when things happen, whether it's the supply takes a hit or whether demand goes up. We saw the toilet paper demand, right, of COVID, right, where all of a sudden, without reason, everybody was buying up toilet paper, and it spiked the demand and it hurt the supply to the point where lumber prices started going up because they were competing with the toilet paper companies to buy the wood to make toilet paper out of. And so you just get these cascading effects.
It's one of the things that I feel like when you look at, say, the last 30 years, the time that we've experienced since we graduated from college, outside of I guess the Afghan war, the Iraq war, but those are kind of isolated things that didn't and like 9/11. I mean, there have been these things, but there hasn't been any kind of global global conflict, like say World War I, World War II. And I think that technology and numbers and data and all this stuff has driven to this level of hyper efficiency without contemplating the unexpected, without contemplating the human part of existence, which is the unexpected.
And it is, and it's so funny because we haven't really had, like you said, like a massive cataclysmic event really in our lifetimes, right? Vietnam, when we were born, was going on, but it was more regional, right? We had the inflationary period of the 70s, but we got through that. You had other events in the 80s. You had the Gulf War in the early 90s, events 2000, September 11th, right? The housing bubble. So the thing is we've had a lot of decent sized hiccups that have thrown us off and caused problems. And but it's one of those, are these, is this the universe telling us to get ready because the big one's coming? The fear with the coronavirus, right? A lot of people are like, is this the precursor to something worse? Because sometimes the world will give us that warning shot across the bow, and I don't know. We'll see what happens. But how many viruses, MRSAs and COVIDs and Ebolas have we had issues with? But again, like you said, a lot of them are regional. But what does it take for something like those to go from regional to pandemic, right?
Yeah. Or and really, I guess if you look at the pandemic, that was the first global convulsion since World War II. And I mean, I guess you're right. I mean, so in many respects, I guess if you put it in historical context, it's kind of like, yeah, of course, like, of course there was problems, because this is something that was like worldwide, and that we haven't had, like you said, there were hiccups. We've never had this kind of like full body convulsion that we just had. And I because I try to, I don't say it's hopeful, but I kind of, I think that, I listen to sports radio a lot just to kind of keep me distracted when I'm like making meals, washing dishes. And like human beings have such a, like, a, I guess, a recency bias, so it's
Yes.
like, once something, if your team's won 10 games in a row, they're the best team ever. If they lose one game, all of a sudden they're the worst. And if they're losing 10 games in a row, they suck. But if they win one game or two games, it's a turnaround, and they're going to win the Super Bowl or whatever, right? I'm a Jets fan, so that's what I hear people talk
That's the
about now.
Jets year. It's the Jets year this year.
Yeah, yeah. But I think, like, they come with the pandemic. It's like, in the 1920s, the world went through the flu, and they got out of the flu, and moved on to other things and other problems. And I think, like, to me, there could certainly be something worse, but I think that, like, we've gone through something really, like, painful, excruciating, horrific, complicated, like, all this stuff. And I think that I try to, like, actually kind of cut us all and myself a bit of slack in coming out of this, because has been a very challenging experience for humanity, right, as much as possible. And it kind of made us, I think, like, it really did force us, especially with the internet being available, to realize, like, how connected we are to each other, and how much we rely on each other, and how vulnerable so much of what we rely on is. And I tried to take away from at least this idea of really trying to appreciate the things that we haven't appreciated before, like, the guys who show up at the grocery store and actually, like, are stocking the shelves even in the middle of the pandemic, the truck drivers who were moving stuff, and the guys who are on those ships moving supplies. And I hope that, everybody can kind of come away from this realizing that we don't live in these tiny little bubbles that we think of. We live in this really intricate, complicated web of humanity, and we need to respect all of everybody, both ways, to realize that we're all kind of in this together, and all, like, very codependent on everything.
Oh, it's yeah. I mean, we're so intertwined now. I mean, it is so funny, how intertwined we become, and part of that's the global trade. You know, we rely on so many products just to keep our country going. Uh, but we really have become closer as just a human race, and it's funny. It's that go back to the yin and the yang, right? We've become so much closer, but the funny thing is we've almost in some ways become further away. How many there are tons of studies now I keep seeing where people talk about, you know, because of social media, we're not getting involved in solid relationships. It's that dopamine high of getting 400 likes, but yet no one has a relationship where they could call somebody up on the phone and be like, dude, I had the worst day today. And they'll sit there and they'll listen to you complain and moan and be there. But, whereas on Facebook, oh, thoughts and prayers. And it's nice to see that, but there's not a connection, right?
There's got to be the physical. I think we need to return a little bit more to the being physically present, like that it matters.
It
But
does.
I will say that I think, to me, what I'd say is a couple of things. I think, one, the internet and social media is kind of introducing us to lots of communities and lots of different ways of thinking that we never really thought of before. Like, living in Long Island, Utah was just a very remote thing that maybe you might read an article about in the local paper once a week or something. Otherwise, you never heard anything
Absolutely.
about it. But now you could do a deep dive into Utah if you want, and whether you like it or not, if there's something that somebody might consider outrageous that happened in Utah or New York, the other side hears about it. And I think that we're learning, and I think that there are, I've heard the term called conflict entrepreneurs, the
Okay.
media politicians, who are just feasting on the things that outrage us for their own benefit. So I think we're being forced to do that. But I think the other thing, what I'd say is, like, I don't know if you've seen with your kids, but, like, my kids, I mean, I feel like the connectivity they have digitally is something that they I'm thankful to see it hasn't replaced real, like, getting together. Like, I still see my daughter trying to go out and see friends all the time. My son still goes out and plays basketball and football and gets out, and my other son, like, will go out to the schoolyard. So I feel like I mean, I guess I see it, and I think as long as we're all sensitive to it, we can kind of, I guess, deal with it. You know what I mean? Because like when I think about it for our generation, the danger was kids sat in front of the TV, right? Like you're gonna go blind if you sit in front of the TV. And I think about what sitting in front of the TV and watching Gilligan's Island and The Brady Bunch and Three's Company and all this, the most inane programming ever, right?
Yeah.
And our heads are going to be turned to mush and all this stuff. And I mean, we're okay. We've screwed up the world in our own way, right? but we've gone by, and I still think that the human progress and progress in general is definitely a wavy line that goes up and down. But I think that overall, we're this thing, the phone, is a pretty revolutionary thing. And a generation ago, we're coming out of college. This doesn't exist yet, right? I mean, we're just starting to get email addresses when we graduated. We didn't even have it at Penn. I didn't have an email address. So a lot of things changed. And I think this connectivity at the end is great to have this kind of knowledge here, but we're learning to adapt to it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, a lot has changed. Oh, I actually did have an email address at Penn. It was an engineering
You were
school.
in engineering. Yeah.
I was an engineer. Only the nerds, only the real
Yeah.
nerds had it. I mean, I never used it, but apparently I had one. But,
Yeah.
but it's interesting. I mean, absolutely. I mean, the thing is it's done, technology done such wonderful things. It's nice where I can, my parents are still in Utah. It's nice I can FaceTime them, right? It's nice to see them as opposed to just talking to them on the phone, right? One of the things came out my son's basketball season last year because of COVID. They cut down on the stands, people in the stands. But the nice thing was they live streamed the games. So that my uncle in Ohio was loving it that he could watch my, his grandnephew, my son play basketball, and my parents and my wife's parents could watch him play basketball, in Utah and in Pennsylvania. So, I mean, it's such wonderful things. But the sad thing is, like you said, there's, there are a lot of people doing wonderful things with it, but there are some people that are doing maybe not as wonderful things with it. Yeah. Right. And then that comes down to, how do we teach our kids to recognize what's good, what's not, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. Don't get wrapped around the axle here, that kind of stuff. So,
yeah. All right. Well, we should probably move on to the rest of our days. But David, thank you so much for this is a really extended conversation covering a whole lot of things with so much more that we could still go on. But thank you for getting together and doing this.
Hey, no worries. I mean, I guess the last thing you said you wanted to ask me before was, where do I see hope in the world?
Yes,
right?
yes.
Since we tried to do this a couple of days ago, you gave me time to think about it.
Good.
But, for me, and it's funny you asked this question because my wife was actually given a talk in our church group back in April, and it was kind of around the same thing. And so even she was asking me the question, like, what gives you hope, right? And the thing is there are so many things I think that give hope. And it's part of that is just opening up your eyes. Like the sunrise gives me hope that it's a new day, right? My kids give me hope. They love me even when I'm a knucklehead, I do the best I can. I make mistakes just as much as they do, right? My wife gives me hope, my wife loves me and I love her. And there's something about, waking up next to that person that you love that just gives you hope that things will be okay. I have students at MMA. They're great students. They're great kids. They're going to do great things in the world. Are there some knuckleheads here? Yes, there are some knuckleheads here, and they're going to get in trouble somewhere along the way. But you know what? For the most part, they're good kids. They're trying to do well in the world. They want to make the world a better place. And I think one of my wife's favorite quotes, and I want to say it's from Mr. Rogers. And Mr. Rogers, like something bad had happened. He was a kid I think he was talking to his mother. And the thing that, is like something bad happened. And she's like, don't focus on the bad. Look for the helpers. Look for the police officers. Look for the fire department. Look for the helpers. Look for the people that are trying to help when things are bad, And I think that part of that is just training our own minds. Look for the helpers. Look for the things that give us hope as opposed to focusing in on the things that take away our hope. And I think if we do that, at the very least, I teach my kids, you control what you can control. You can't control anybody else. You can control yourself. You can control how you look at the world, how you observe the world, who you keep in your world, who you push out of your world, you can control all that. And I think, it's one of those, like, if we spent more time focusing on the things that gives us each individual hope, because everybody's different, right? You're different. I'm different. Maybe some of the things between you and I, uh, overwrap, whatever, they cross over each other, that kind of stuff. But sometimes we just got to open our eyes. Instead of looking down, look up, see what's going on around us. That bird, like I said, when I was at Auschwitz, the birds chirping, it was such a pretty song, and you're just like, how could such a pretty thing, a pretty bird, a pretty song be going on in a place where evil existed, and that's another good sign. Like, the world moves on. There are good things out there, and you just got to look for them.
Yeah. Right. All right. Well, thank you for sharing that. And again, thank you for joining the show. And thank you to everybody out there listening. May you go out and explore our country with curiosity, respect, compassion, and humility. All right. Take care, David. Thank you.
Thank you.